Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how to train lagging muscle groups that may be underdeveloped relative to the rest of your physique. First, let's cover exactly what we mean when referring to lagging muscle groups. Essentially, this refers to muscles on our physique which are less developed in size relative to the rest of our physique. It is very common for lifters to have certain muscle groups which are naturally more or less developed than others. It is rare for trainees to have perfect symmetry and proportions for all muscle groups. However, we should understand that muscular development is all relative to your own physique. If you are new to lifting and you feel like all muscle groups are underdeveloped, then these aren't considered lagging muscle groups. This is simply a lack of muscle mass in general. Most of us want to increase muscle mass over time, and we always want to be more muscular than we already are, even in highly experienced lifters. The point to understand is that lagging muscle groups are those which are underdeveloped relative to the rest of your physique, not an overall lack of muscle mass. So now that we understand what lagging muscle groups are, why is it that most of us have lagging muscle groups? Well, there are a number of potential reasons for this. There are genetic factors, like our bone structure, responsiveness to training, and the natural size of our muscles. And there are also environmental factors, such as our lifestyle, past sports, past training styles, and more. We could go into detail about each of these factors, but the bottom line is that we probably have lagging muscle groups, and the solution is essentially the same, regardless of the underlying cause. Before getting into the details about training lagging muscles, let's first cover when you should even try to specialize to emphasize these muscles. Well, there is no clear, distinct answer to this, but here are some general considerations we should make before deciding to specifically emphasize certain muscle groups. First, we should make the distinction between lagging muscles versus an underdeveloped physique. Like we mentioned previously, lagging muscles specifically refer to those which are underdeveloped relative to the rest of your physique, rather than being globally under-muscled. If you are relatively new to training, it may be wise to just implement a solid training routine for a few years and then see which muscles respond the best and worst to resistance training. Then once you've confirmed a muscle is lagging more than the others, you can then decide to specialize. Another consideration here is personal preference. Most people watching this video are probably not competitive bodybuilders or physique athletes who are after a particular look. These athletes have certain criteria that they need to achieve to maximize on-stage performance. However, recreational lifters don't have these requirements, so they are free to determine what muscle groups they want to train more than others. Some trainees may not want to emphasize specific muscle groups and may want to maximally develop others. For example, a recreational male lifter may want to preference the chest and arms more so than the glutes and hamstrings, while a female lifter may preference leg training over chest growth. This is completely fine, and it is totally up to the individual to decide which muscles they want to emphasize over others. So for this reason, trainees may want to specialize in muscles that aren't necessarily lagging, but they may still want to maximize their development. We also need to consider the individual response to resistance training. As we probably know from observing other lifters, there can be a substantial difference in the individual response to the same resistance training program. Two trainees can perform the exact same training program, and each can see substantially different rates of muscle growth. This may be based on numerous factors, including past training history and genetic differences in our response to training. To demonstrate this idea, let's have a look at this study, which compared the effects of training with different volumes on muscle growth. We aren't really concerned with the actual intervention here. I just chose this study because it displayed the individual responses of each participant. Each line in this figure represents the changes in muscle thickness from pre to post training for each of the muscles measured. As we can see here, most trainees experienced some muscle growth across the intervention, although there were some lifters who actually saw decreases in muscle size. For example, this subject saw a decrease in triceps thickness in the moderate volume training group. Furthermore, those who did see hypertrophy gains achieved this at different magnitudes. Some saw very large increases in muscle thickness, while others only saw minute changes. For example, this lifter saw a much faster rate of quadriceps growth than average in the low volume training group. This is just one example of how each lifter responds differently to resistance training. This also brings up the topic of non-responders. Non-responders are considered those who simply don't respond to resistance training, meaning those who don't see muscle growth from training. However, there is not really a true thing such as a non-responder. It is very unlikely that an individual won't see any muscle growth regardless of how much effort they train with. However, like we know, the response to resistance training is highly individual, so there certainly are low responders. But this doesn't mean they can't make significant hypertrophy gains over time, it just means that their rate of muscle growth may be slower. This research review explored the evidence on the theoretical concept of non-responders. The authors concluded that it is very unlikely for true non-responders to exist, rather it is just an exaggerated term for those who may not respond particularly well to resistance training. Furthermore, just because a trainee doesn't respond well to a certain training protocol, it doesn't mean they won't respond well to a different training method. The authors stated that trainees can improve the response to resistance training by simply manipulating training variables. So this whole discussion about the individual response to resistance training relates back to lagging muscle groups. It may be that certain muscle groups simply don't respond as well to training compared with other muscles, even for the same person. So to bring these muscle groups up, we probably need to manipulate some training variables to improve our response to training. Let's now cover how to do this. The first thing we should understand when training our lagging muscle groups is that it is not any different than hypertrophy training for any other muscle. The principles of hypertrophy training still applies to lagging muscles in the same way as they apply to well-developed muscles. What this means is that there is no special or unique training methods for these muscles, we just need to manipulate certain training variables to preference their development. With some well thought out programming, we can adjust our training program to ensure these muscles receive a better hypertrophic stimulus. This will hopefully result in a faster rate of muscle growth compared with how it was being trained before. Furthermore, sometimes this may also mean that other muscle groups will have to take a back seat for now. If we want to increase the rate of muscle growth of lagging muscles, then other well-developed muscles may have to see a slightly slower rate of muscle growth. This doesn't mean they won't grow at all or will regress, they will still grow over time, but maybe at a slightly slower rate than previously. So before intentionally emphasizing lagging muscle groups, we first need to look at our current training routine to establish how the muscle is currently being trained. It is important to observe whether the muscle is being trained as effectively as the other more developed muscles, or whether the program is set up in a way which isn't very effectively training the lagging muscle. This could be the cause of the lagging muscle because it isn't really being trained effectively in your current routine. So before deciding to really emphasize a lagging muscle, let's first make sure it isn't being neglected in your current training routine. Instead, maybe we are better off rearranging our current routine to make sure the lagging muscle is being trained adequately. The first and primary variable we can manipulate to bring up a lagging muscle group is volume. For hypertrophy training, it is best to quantify volume via the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. It is quite clear that hypertrophy has a dose-response relationship with volume, where more sets tends to result in greater muscle growth, assuming all sets are taken fairly close to failure. For example, this study compared the same training routine being performed with either 16, 24, or 32 sets per muscle group per week. As we can see, a clear dose-response relationship was seen, whereby more volume resulted in greater muscle growth for all muscles measured. So with this being said, our first point of action to train lagging muscle groups would be to increase the volume which they are trained with. If we increase weekly volume of our lagging muscle groups, it will likely result in a greater hypertrophic response and ultimately a faster rate of muscle growth. However, this also means that we may have to decrease training volume of other muscle groups. This is because if we add more volume to one muscle group, it means that our overall time and effort spent training has increased, which may not be practical for some individuals. If you have the time and effort available to dedicate to extra training, then this is completely fine. However, for some trainees, it may be wise to decrease volume for other muscle groups. Our best option here would be to decrease the volume of one or two of our most developed muscle groups, which are already ahead of the rest of our physique. So while our lagging muscle groups will likely experience a faster rate of muscle growth with more volume, our stronger muscle groups may see a slightly slower rate of growth. This will allow a more equal overall rate of development so the lagging muscles can catch up. Another variable we can manipulate is frequency. While frequency doesn't seem to have a significant impact on muscle growth when volume is equated, it can potentially have a small effect. For example, this study explored the effects of training a muscle 5 times per week compared with 1 time per week under volume matched conditions. It was found that muscle growth was superior with the high frequency approach compared with training each muscle once per week. This is likely a result of training quality and performance being greater with each session with the higher frequency. As we can see, the high frequency group trained with a greater total volume load, indicating that per session performance was superior. So even with the same volume, we may want to train lagging muscle groups with a higher frequency. This will allow us to train the muscles in a less fatigued state each session, improving overall performance and intent. Furthermore, increasing frequency may have an indirect influence on volume. If we train a muscle more frequently, we have more opportunity to accumulate volume. And as we know, volume appears to have a significant impact on muscle growth. So if a trainee is currently training their lagging muscle group once or twice per week, it may be a good idea to train it 3 or 4 times per week to improve lifting quality and total weekly volume. And the last variable we can manipulate to bring up lagging muscle groups is exercise order. It is controversial as to whether exercise order has any significant influence on hypertrophy outcomes. Most research shows similar muscle growth regardless of what order exercises are performed in. This meta-analysis concluded that while strength gains are superior in exercises performed first in a training session, hypertrophy gains are similar regardless of exercise order. However, most of these studies use a similar protocol, where they compare the effects of compound then isolation lifts versus isolation then compound lifts. To my knowledge, there aren't any studies directly looking at training a specific muscle group first and directly assessing hypertrophy of that muscle group rather than random muscle measurements. It may be that training a muscle first in a session could favorably result in superior muscle growth of that particular muscle. This would make some theoretical sense, as we are likely to train with higher quality with the exercises performed at the beginning of the session compared with the end of the session. So it could potentially be beneficial for lifters to train the lagging muscle group earlier in the training session as opposed to last in the session. This could allow trainees to lift with greater quality and may translate to superior long-term muscle growth. So now we've explored the training variables that can be manipulated to help bring up lagging muscle groups. However, we should also understand that despite doing all that we can to bring these muscles up, they may still be lagging compared to other muscles. In almost all cases, we can definitely increase their rate of muscle growth, but it may forever be a slight weak point of your physique. Furthermore, the muscle may never be as big or impressive as other muscles due to unmodifiable factors such as bone structure, muscle shape, or insertion points. So while we should always do our best to bring these muscles up, they may never reach the same level of development as our strongest muscle groups. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. Before trying to completely specialize training a lagging muscle group, we first need to ensure that the muscle is being trained adequately in your current routine. So rather than trying to prioritize it over other muscle groups initially, maybe we should first make sure it is being trained somewhat effectively already. If this is the case and you determine that it is truly a lagging muscle group, then you can proceed to manipulate variables to maximize its rate of growth. We also need to remember that a lagging muscle group is no different to any other muscles. It is likely just less responsive to resistance training. Generally, muscles respond well to higher training volumes, higher frequencies, and with high quality. Therefore, to increase the rate of muscle growth of a lagging muscle group, we can manipulate such variables. Our first priority would be to increase the number of sets we are training the muscle with. Second would be to increase training frequency, and third would be to train the lagging muscle group earlier in the session. This will increase both the quality and quantity of training for that muscle group and will likely result in a faster rate of growth. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.